Do I need a microphone?
Yeah.
I hate these things. Okay. I understand we have a problem in the garage. I've got to shut up so you can get out of here by 9:30. And that's going to be hard for me to do. So I'm going to stick to my script, as long as it doesn't blow off the page, and I'll get going. Well, I may add that almost to the day, 69 years ago, I did my first archaeological dig. It was in Bartown, St. Albans, just north of London, of the old Roman city, where you went down about 18 inches, 24 inches, uncovered the tesserae and the stonework, and you took your stick with all the white dashes and black dashes on it, and you photographed it, and then you covered the whole thing over. Because that's the only way you can preserve them. If you left it open for at least 2 nights and went back to it, about half of it would have been gone. That's the trouble with heritage work. We do have vandals. Ask anybody that's tried to preserve a house in this area. However, tonight we're going to deal with the development of the river, and my title I've given to it is The River That Built Mississauga. Because it was on the river that the development took place that turned this in from a wasteland into a modern city. What was here when the land was first opened for settlement? Now, there's a lot of ancient history around, but somebody said there was a church on the Britannia Road in 1820, and there was a church somewhere else in 1819, all of which is totally untrue, because the records are very good. We have 3 of them. The first are the surveyor's notes. When Bristow and Street had the contract to survey the new survey, which is everything from the baseline, which is Eglinton Avenue today, north, they were given strict orders to record everything they found. They found nothing. And if you don't believe that, you can find the records in the Ontario Archives, Series CB1, Appendix E. They're very interesting reading and gives you a first-hand record of what the ancient lands were. Incidentally, there was no record whatever of an Indian trail. The second is in the article written by, we think, by little William Mackenzie himself. We don't know, it was never signed, but it appeared in the first issue of the Colonial Advocate, his newspaper, in July 1824. And he described Streetsville in 1824 with, you can read it in Mary Manning's book, what was there. And then he said, when I first came here 4 years ago, there was none. Which is the other of the 3 reports we have as to what the settlers found here. And the third is another very interesting one. The first missionaries to move into this country were from the Methodist Episcopal Conference, that's what they called it, of Genesee, New York. He was a young man from New Jersey named Fitch Reed. He was sent up here by the local M.E. bishops to go and find what was available in new settlements and to take charge of the York Chapel, which had just been built in 1818, a congregation of 24 people. And that was sited on the western outskirts of York. The plaque that commemorates it is on the Bank of Commerce building on Key Street. That's how far out the suburbs were in 1819. Well, Fitch Reed was a remarkable man. He only served here for 2 years. That was common. He served all his life as an itinerant missionary. And towards the end of his life, he was honored by being made an honorary doctorate and all these sort of stuff. And he wrote a speech describing his experiences when he first went into York and the new settlements. First-hand information. The first year, he just went up Young Street, finding what he could, and looking after his little congregation in York. Oh, by the way, he was paid by the missionary fund of the church in New Jersey. They had a fund called the Missionary Mite. Every member of the little congregations were asked to pay 1 cent per year into the fund. And by the time that Fitch Reed got to receive the offer to go to York and the new settlements, they had $350 in the kitty. And he lived on that for 2 years, plus an assistant. And his assistant, by the way, I can't think of his name, but anyway, he comes from Belleville. And in the first year, they were just too busy looking after the local stores. The second year, 1821, they went into the bush, he writes. They went into the bush. There wasn't a map. There wasn't a road. There wasn't a sign. All he had was a compass and an axe. So you see what our first settlers had to face. They had to get rid of a lot of trees. They had to find the surveyor stakes, because that's all the surveyors left was a stake. They surveyed the lines up and down, and every farm they put a stake in there. And then when they came between the 5th and the 6th lots, they left a road allowance. They never wrote them up. So if anybody tells you there was a church on Britannia in 1820, Britannia wasn't even open road in 1820. However, that's history for them. See, the basic problem with history in Streetsville or in Mississauga is about at the beginning of the last century, we had a movement on to rewrite the ancient memories. And they did, but they never checked them. They said things that were absolutely, totally impossible to be true. And one of our jobs as historians is to straighten them out. And you'll find tonight that a lot of what I talk about may be a little bit different, but everything I say, I can prove. Now, how were they going to get rid of the trees? Oxen, no good. Your back gets too darn tired. And some of these trees were pretty big. They turned to the only thing they had, which is what we call a muley saw. I guess I should have the first picture on here. Where do I push? Good. Well, that's all right. I'll keep going. this is the sign of a saw they used. It's called a muley saw. It's entirely made of wood. Any good mechanics in the crowd can tell me what you call that thing.
What?
You have them on lawnmowers, and you have them on anything where you're transferring power from a circle to a straight up down. It's called the Pitman rod. Do you have any idea how it got that name? No. Oh, that's a good guess. The first saws that they used were just an ordinary, something like a crosscut saw. And there was one man that stood on top of the log and followed the line. He was called the sawyer. The guy that did the work was the guy down in the pit below who pulled the saw down and then bent it back and pulled the saw down. He got all the nice pine sawdust, and of course he was called the pit man. And we placed him here with this, which is not a bad idea. The saw, now that wheel is a modern, these saws were the only saws used on the river for over 40 years. The blade runs up and down what is a glorified window frame, actually, sliding up and down in this frame. The power comes from this wheel, which could be over or middle, but it was usually like this, sitting on a small river. The first one was built by James Glendinning on, not the credit, but on the mullet. Mullet you could walk across. But there was enough high bank that he had enough room to put that in the water and it would turn into a grind saw. And he had the first saw going about 1821. We think some of the logs that he turned out are still in Streetsville, in what we call the Montreal House, which is a corner of, well, you know the Centre. Across the road from the Centre was a corner house with the barber shop and the ladies' toilet, kids stuff and so on. That's the building. Part of that was built by the Barnards in 1820, 1821, with saws sawn on Glendinning's saw, because it was the only saw there. And which is a remarkable thing to have a building still in Streetsville that's 180 years old, using the same pine timbers in the original. By 1817, there were 19 of these saws on the river. Now, obviously, knowing the Credit River, you wouldn't put that in the river unless you could protect it, because Credit has a very bad reputation for having floods. Those people here are old enough to remember Hurricane Hazel and vouch for that. When the river wants to get angry, it'll take everything down out of the river and where else in the lake. Well, anyway, that's the muley saw. And that was the saw that cut all the timber in the river area for over 40 years, until we invented more power and the circular saw. Now, this was a difficult saw to work with. First of all, what do you think the saw was made of? Any guesses? It wasn't made of steel. Beg pardon? No, no. It was made of wrought iron. Wrought iron, which is a good material. Well, in fact, it was the only material they had, because steel did not become generally available until about 1860, when we had the Vesicant process to make steel. Isn't that right? Well, anyway, This is what we had for the first 1820 to about 1860 to saw anything on the river. Incidentally, I should have mentioned the fact that the development on the river was from the baseline north. The baseline is today's Eglinton Avenue. Why was there no development below on the river? Anybody take a guess? When the treaty was made, 1 mile either side of the river was given to the Indians, and it virtually froze the land for 50 years. The Indians that were settling there were Ojibways, a much less developed tribe. It had just come down 100 years ago from the north. There were hunters and gatherers. The previous tribes had been in this area were the Hurons and the Iroquois. Both, they were related, they both spoke the same language. The Ojibways spoke Algonquin, they're entirely different language. The Iroquois built houses. They grew crops. They were quite well advanced. The Ojibways on the land on the Credit River grew nothing. They hunted and fished. In 1824, the government tried to help them out by building them a little village, which is down on the Lower Credit. And they gave them a schoolhouse. They even put a little saw in, and in 1847, they canceled the whole deal. They were getting absolutely nowhere and knew it. And so what was left of the Ojibways, called by this time the New Credits, went to Brantford, where the government thought it would be a good idea if they could live beside one of the Mohawk tribes or one of the Algonquin, one of the Iroquois tribes, and learn a bit from them. And thank God it has happened. Because the New Credit Indians are not bad today. They've come on an enormous stretch of time. Not as fast as the Japanese. Most people don't realize that in 1866, the ordinary Japanese was a peasant and a slave. Look what he's doing today. And he done it in about 5 generations. What about the Russians? The Russian serf was not released from bondage until 1867. Look at them today. Send a man to the moon. That's what can be done when a people wants to develop and it allows itself to develop. Whereas the Ojibways sat on the Credit River from 1710 till about 1847 and did nothing. That's a real lesson there for the development of people. However, we'll step up now to the next thing is, where's my push? The next. Yeah. The next development after the computer saw was water power on a mill. People needed a mill to grind grain. Now this is a typical one. It doesn't happen to be in Mississauga. This was taken in Nova Scotia. You have and everyone refers, in every record we've got of the very first mill onwards, a solid stone foundation. Now you couldn't do that on the side of the river. You had to make a bypass. Mr. Street, when he put his first mill in, he put a little brush dam about 500 feet north of his mill site. And then he dug a mill race down to where the mill was. And then he did the one thing that every person building a mill on the river had to do, was to create a hole. And I have some light here now to show if that's done. Most people think that the dams were what held the water. They didn't. What caused the power on the mill was the fall of the water. Can you get the light on this?
Yeah, we just have to turn off the projector.
Too modern.
Has anybody got a candle?
There we go. I had to convince it.
Okay, we'll move this over. Well, I guess I shouldn't move it too far. Well, anyway, this is how Street did it. No, that's okay. He had his mill site here. He built his brush dam 500 feet up there. And it was nothing. You know, flood come by, no event, thing back together a couple of days. And he had his mill race. The head was there, the head gate. In other words, we didn't want the water to drop the gate. And the mill race came down here. And the secret of getting the fall was here. And how do you think he and everyone else on the river did it? Well, I give you a clue. When he wanted to build his little mill along the river, it's where the Bartown mill is now. I can't think of it. What was the name of that first guy? It's on my notes, but I can't read it. But passes to read it like this. No, Glendenning was not a miller. He just sawed over. And incidentally, I have to remember that. Do you know how long that little saw run for Glendenning? Well, you can read in the reviews of 1881 and 1882 that when the spring flood is on and the fall rains come through, he was running his mill. He ran that mill for over 60 years. Now, what you have here, the river comes down here, falling a certain bit all the way. So if you stop and put that dead level, I should have that. That's how low we're going. Let's do it this way. You put your little brush dam up here, and then you dig a ditch down there. Now, the time they get down here, the river in the meantime has been doing that. So you actually got a canal. And then you put your mill wheel in. And the trick is to get the water away from the bottom of the mill. So you dug that away up there. And this was longer than this. As a matter of fact, when, I can't give you his name. The guy that, he was the wrong side of the political fence in 1837. He had to fight for property. But he was there for about 15 years. Comfort's Mill, you're right. He had a whole farm in order to get enough fall to run his little mill. Because he had as much of the digging south of the mill as he had north of it. And that was done up and down the river. It's the only way you could do it. Because you couldn't trust the dam as such with the materials of those days. I mean, you couldn't build a stone dam. It cost you an arm and a leg. you couldn't build a wooden dam. The first bunch of icebergs going down the river would take it down. Well, anyway, that's how they were done. Now, next point, where's next one? Who's got the other thing you had to have now the next one. This is, by the way, is an overshot wheel. That's what I'm going to show you here. There were three kinds of wheels you could have. An overshot, like that. A pressed wheel, and then of course, like we had on the, this little saw, an undershot wheel. And what one you used would depend entirely on how much fall you had. And that was geography. There's nothing much you could do to fix that. Next one. Now this is a schematic. It's actually from a textbook of about 1806 of what a flour mill was. I've always wondered why they were so high. Anybody got any idea? What do you have all the heat on it? There's the word. This one has two runs of stone. This one here is the bed stone, and this is the runner. This is the one that moves. And then underneath, you have a bunch of fancy balances and so on. These are called mill irons. And this is how you adjusted the two stones one to the other. It wasn't done from the top, it was done from the bottom. So this had to be absolutely solid. Next picture. There is the mill at Streetsville. I just did put that one in to show you what it was. Why it was so high. Well, maybe I can explain it this way. There's a story that's repeated all the time. It was written by a Scottish clergyman named Carruthers, published a book in 1861, and he described something he'd heard about in Streetsville 13 years after it had happened. And he tried to explain how Mr. Street got his mill wheel, not his mill wheel, but his grist wheel. And the mill that was built without bolts. What's that? How can you build a great big wooden building like that without bolts?
Trowel, wooden pegs.
Sorry?
Trowels.
No. You ladies should have caught that. When you go down to a place that sells clothing, materials, when you come down off the shelf of this great big thing, what's that called? You got it. To be built without bolts meant that he had no sifters, because the grain between grindings, you grind the grain on one wheel, or you grind it on another wheel, and between the two, you take the grist up to the upper shelves and put it through the bolts, which are fine, usually linen screens. So you took out the bran, you took out the wheat germ, and you ended up with what would end up as reasonably white flour. If you didn't, what you got was a home meal. And even in those days, the sign of a good housekeeper was a nice white loaf. And you couldn't make a nice white loaf if you still had the wheat germ and the bran in it. Plus the fact, in those days without refrigeration, how would you keep wheat good or grist good with wheat germ in it? Wheat germ is very oily, and the weather gets hot, it stinks. Next picture. Oh, this is out of order, but I'll tell you something. This is the same mill, but taken from another angle. But here again, solid stone foundations. Because your mill had to be steady. Next one, I'll come back. Yeah. So this is what a couple of millstones look like. This is the peg that comes up and down below. The runner sits on top of this, and the grain, as it gets ground down, comes out at the edge, and you have a little thing of rubber here that you can empty out, and then you can check what you got. Very slow process, by the way. Well, you can imagine that. Next one, please. Now this is the art of the miller. And this was Mr. Street's tragedy. He couldn't get one. The miller was the man who could cut the stones so that the grain would come out. This is the runner. This is the base stone. Solid right in. And it's there, that wooden thing, or this one here. This was the wooden case that fitted on top of the upper when she was going. Now this was the kind of millstone that made every pound of flour on the Credit River hollow. Like to get 75 years. This process was not changed until about 1895. It's a crude process, but it worked. Next picture. And the secret, I told you, was getting the various kinds of grooves. And that had all done by hand. And this had to be dead level. And sitting on its axle, when you call it, it couldn't wobble a hair. Because if it did, this stone would hit the big stone. And what would happen? When you had two pieces of stone hitting each other at fair speed, what's going to happen?
Spark.
Yeah, you're going to have sparks, and you never know what happens to sparks when you got flour in you. That's why most flour mills burnt down. It was a dangerous occupation. Well, anyway, we had 19 of these on the river by 1827. Next picture. And then, as development, this is a century-old picture. It was taken before 1867. Now, this was the hide mill. This was the biggest mill on the river. It's called the hide mill, but its proper name is the Ontario mill. It's at the foot of Ontario Street in Streetsville. Now, there's another mill name that's honored in Streetsville. Anybody take a guess? Alpha Mills Road was the road into Alpha Mill. Still there. No, I mean the road is not. We got it deep there. And the dam they use, you notice the dam is quite small. The dam is not more than about 4 feet high. But the trick, you see, was in getting it out. This incidentally was a rope works. This is taken from the east side of the river. Now this was owned by a lady. Their tombstone is in the Streetsville Cemetery. His husband was Heman Hyde. And she was married. She was quite a girl. And back in the trees, you see what kind of one of those is the old girls. Okay, next one. We'll come back to that later. Oh, we're a little ahead of ourselves. no, it's fine. Now the second part, how's the time going? The next part I wanted to tell you, what I told you about the mills, about the saws, and about the mills. Now I want to tell you about 3 things that happened on the river that were mighty bins. One of them actually is a mighty bin. The other one wasn't and now is. And the last one always was. We started at the lower end. If you were around this area in 1904, the magic word was electricity. Only a few years before, the light bulb had been invented. And then somebody found out that you'd take power and take it around on poles. And you could string a line around your attic and drop a cattail in every room, turn the switch, and wonderful, you had light. You didn't have to have a smelling kerosene lantern anymore. This was one we can't appreciate what it must have meant to a housewife in 1904 to have electricity just for the light. And of course, once the magic word was said, every mill site on the river, that any potential whatever, was tapped as a source of electricity. The big mill at Cataract, wires went to Brandon. Huttonville, the little mill in Huttonville, same thing. And Streetsville wasn't going to be left behind. According to the Streetsville Review, in 1904, the municipality of Streetsville offered Mr. Grass, who ran the Streetsville mill, $3,000 to put in a hydro plant and string some lines around the town. He accepted, and by the December of that year, he said that he had got his dam built up a bit because he needed more water power. And it was all set to go. Well, what happened, we don't know. But in 1907, 3 years later, the Public Utilities Commission was formed. And they knew that where the hide mill was, there was that old dam. Now, could I get that hide mill back again, the big white, tall white one? Yeah. This dam hadn't been destroyed, but in 1867, here's a sad story, that place burned down. Have you any idea what? Well, there was such a thing as the wheat bankruptcy. In 1856, almost every mill on the river went bankrupt. It's a long story, but shows you how the world turns. In 1854, the war against Russia began. Now, Russia was the great wheat exporter. And Turkey was in the war, so any wheat coming out of the Ukraine into the Black Sea couldn't get through the Bosphorus because Turkey controlled it. Any grain grown north of that went up through Poland to the other north, the big sea up there, but the British Navy controlled it. The price of wheat in Liverpool went from $36 a ton to $300 a ton. Now, every miller on the river here harvested wheat from his neighbors that fall, but it never got to England. It got about as far as Montreal and frozen in. By the next spring, the war was over. And the wheat which had been bought in Streetsville on the basis of a $300 a bushel was dumped in Liverpool for $36 a bushel. That's not a way to make any money. Every mill went bankrupt. And this, of course, is another interesting side of the story. Goodham and Works from Toronto, they used a lot of grain, but they had a better income than grain, flour. They had whiskey. So they come out to Streetsville. They bought the Meadowvale mill. They bought the Hyde mill. It was the biggest mill in town, and they bought it for so many cents on the dollar. But the same thing, something else happened, called the wheat midge. They've been growing wheat on the land around Streetsville for 40, 50 years. The land was getting tired. They had no fertilizer. Didn't know what fertilizer was. So the wheat was getting pretty stringy. And when grain or anybody that's a gardener knows, when your plants get weak, it's an invitation to anybody around to come in and have lunch. And the wheat midge hit the same time as the bankruptcies. So these poor people, couldn't run a mill because there wasn't enough wheat mill. They turned that mill into a flax mill, basically in response to something else. What happened in 1861? Don't you know your history, folks? A thing called the American Civil War. And all the cotton which came from the southern states was embargoed. There's a few bales got across the Texas border. A few bales were sent across by the runners to Bermuda. But the bulk of the cotton stayed in bales in the southern ports. So what were you going to do for a piece of cotton in Canada? Well, what happened was very simple. They turned that into a linen mill. And they ran it for a few years until the Civil War was over. And then the same thing that had happened with the wheat prices happened with cotton. Because you had thousands and thousands of bales in these southern ports dumped right on the market. Because the southerners were broke. They'd sell them for anything, just to get a couple of dollars. And you can't compare linen with cotton. You ladies know that. Linen's a fraction over the most expensive thing you can do. Linen was hard to grow, hard to make, and therefore very expensive. So, a year after, now we're not making any hints here, but a year after the cotton market opened, that thing burned down. Leaving that dam. Now I said that Streetsville had its little power dam. Mr. Gracchus had his mill. Can I have that Gracchus picture? They're both together. No, back again. This is the Gracchus picture from the water side. That was a first attempt to bring electricity to Streetsville. It wasn't very good. There just wasn't enough power there. So in 1907, the Public Utilities Commission was formed. Now would you go back to that dam? The city owned the dam at the old hide mill. Oh, you missed it. Back again. That's it. And had the bright idea that down in the basement, this was a stone basement, it's still there, they could run a water tower and generate electricity. And they did. The PUC was formed in 1907, and it worked until it became part of the PUC in Mississauga in what, 72, in that area. And that little plant kept Streetsville in electricity for over 50 years. Now, most people don't know that. Streetsville had its own electric plant for 50 years. Now, eventually, of course, as you know, when you got a string of lights, then mother has to have an iron, and then she has to have an electric stove to get rid of the smelly old oil and all that. And the demand keeps. Eventually, of course, the little mill here couldn't handle it. We had to join with the hydro grid. But right up until after the war, where is he? Where are you, Norm? That guy used to go down to that little hydro plant and watch the meters so that Streetsville didn't run over its load. We never had a brownout, never had any shortage of electricity in Streetsville, as long as that little bill was running. And incidentally, I haven't got a picture of it. If you walk up to Queen Street in Streetsville to the old PUC building, which has now got new buildings around it, that original rotor is still there. It's been preserved. Originally put in, I think, in 1907.
The Francis Wheel.
Beg pardon?
That is the Francis Wheel, that water.
France, I don't know who made it. They call it the Francis Wheel at the time. Well, anyway, now I said we had this wonderful need for electricity. There was one attempt made on the Credit River to put in a large plant, and that was the Arundel Dam project. It was a wonderful idea. From a designer's point of view, it was perfect. But the organizers ran out of money, and if you're pouring a concrete wall, you don't want any breaks. They started in 1904 to run a concrete dam across the river. Show me one that we got those pictures now. Yeah. Trouble was, well, there were two troubles. They used pit run gravel from a Galt farm, ran it down on a little tramway. Well, pit run gravel is the worst thing you can put into a strong piece of concrete. It should have been graded. It should have been crushed so that you got a clean mix. And the second mistake was they used a natural cement. See, the so-called cement that we use today, Portland cement, is a manufactured product. Very standard. You know exactly what you get when you open the bag. A natural cement, being a natural product, is variable. And it doesn't set as well as a Portland cement is. But this was 1904. And And they started to put this wall across the base. Can I have my light again? I'll show you how they did. There may be somebody in this room that remembers what that is. The river comes down there. And this is a high bank. Until it gets down to just before you get to the church. It was a wonderful idea. They said, why can't we put a wall across here somewhere and divert the water through a tunnel under the road and put a generating plant there. They could have theoretically, it was a good idea. They could do 13,000 months. There was lots of water because this main idea was just 125 acres as a storage hole, because that's the other problem with Governor's Street. The demand is not steady. The demand at midnight is not very high. At 8 o'clock in the morning, everybody's got up and everybody's cooking breakfast and everybody's doing everything else, and the demand goes right up to you. Same thing at 5 o'clock. Everybody goes home, everybody throws the turn on, every light gets turned on. So the demand is highly variable. And the only way you can solve it in a waterworks is have a storage tank. So you can put your water through your dynamo as the demand asks for it. Well, there's one thing desperately wrong, is they put the wall of the dam in the wrong place. This was fine. What they should have done was put the dam there. And then they could have built it like this, arches. The way a dam should. They could have had about 4 or 5. Does anybody here know Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom in Constantinople? It was built about 600. It's been up for 1,400 years. Just as sound as it was built. And it's all arches. Because the Romans were good at that. You can go to Spain today and then see where aqueducts were built across for miles. All of them. Now these people never thought that if they put big concrete buttresses in there, how many did they need? I don't know, 4 or 5. And then put arches that could be made outside and slipped down as the need arises. And this would be your spillway. And these would be set. And that thing would have been standing in. But whoever the design decided to build this wall across, it was 500 feet long. Made of poor gravel and doubtful natural cement. And to make matters worse, they started to build it in 1904, ran out of money, had to form a new company, and the dam stayed there for several years without any on it. Now you can't do that with concrete. Another picture. And it was a darn shame. Next one. Now this are some pictures from the Jean Anderson collection. She must have taken these herself. This was their attempt to build the dam. It's not a bad design, but it didn't need to be that big. They could have come this way and cut the dam in half. Next one. There's some, I said, showing how they made it. This is the kind of gravel they were using. It was terrible stuff. Is anybody here who remember back in the 30s when some of that dam was still around? And I used to go to Galt. Used to ride out and you could see that some of the dam's still there. And you could go in and you could pick the bit out of the water. Yes?
No.
Oh,
You can see they didn't use any proper enforcement, they threw.
well, of course, the enforcement wasn't necessary if the design was good. But the basic problem is the gravel was bad, the cement was worse, actual cement, and the design was worse.
What did you think of, did they use lime cement?
No, an actual cement, I understand, did you see it came out of shallow water?
Just to lime the natural cement?
Yeah. That they said that we used to supposed to use about 120 carloads to do this.
The original limestone ground up. Yeah, it's big. Natural cement, you know, like Portland cement was invented.
Oh no, but Portland cement was already there, but the natural cement, there was one plant in Willow, and there was one plant in Shallow Lake up north of Wyoming.
Yeah.
And we don't know for sure, because the records are all gone, what natural cement they used for this, but they certainly didn't use Portland cement.
Well, it wasn't probably fire.
Hey, Brian?
Portland cement is done in Moody.
Oh, yeah, it's a different product.
So it's just taken out of the ground.
Oh yeah, the natural cement was, it's highly variable being a natural product. Well, anyway, the story is that this thing, in 1920, a flood came down, took out a portion of the wall. The company that was in charge gave up on it. It was going to cost them $10,000 to repair the wall, and they were pretty shrewd to figure that even if they got it repaired, it wasn't going to be much good. Hydro took it over in 1916, and they reduced it and cut the production way down, and they ran it until about 1923, when the big plants in Niagara came along, and this little one here was worth having, and because it was a pain in the neck. And then the stuff, the big 24-foot tunnel where the generators were, it stayed for, I can't find out anybody that knows when they took the machine. The tunnel still there. Well, anywho, by 1926, I opened it up. And then in the 30s, they started to go up the dam. It was dangerous. And there's nothing there now. It was a garbage dump. I'm sorry, a sanitary landfill for quite a while until they got the level of the park up to where it is now. But when you see what is there now, and compare with, say, Victoria Park in Niagara Falls, and what it might have been, you could have had the nicest hydroelectric plant in Ontario, because it was the largest dam in Ontario when it was they tried to do it. But again, poor workmanship, poor material, poor design. Disaster. Now, let's go up the river a bit to the Comfort Mill. The Comfort Mill had originally been built in the late 20s, 2020, I was mentioned by Street. And it was a small mill. We think it was up around the other side of those streets. We don't know, there's nothing there. And William Comfort got on the wrong side of the bend when he got up in 1837 and had to flee. And the place sat idle for many years. And then the Barber Company, who were in Georgetown, decided that they needed a bigger place. So they came down and bought this whole this whole farm. 100 acres. started to build the big stone building. And it was an enormous complex. I have here a copy of the story about it in the Walker and Mills Atlas of Peel, 1877. Now, you know what these are, don't you, these atlases? They were vanity shows. If you wanted a picture and an article, you paid. That's how the publishers made their money. And they were doing it all over Ontario. I know there's two of them published in Wilf, and I know our family were in two. And I know who wrote the articles. Well, anyway, the Toronto Woolen Mills, Streetsville. This company went under a number of names, and I have yet to find out whether they were incorporated or whether they were partnerships. All we know, the original title was in William Barber and Brother.
And
Brothers.
And brothers.
And Brothers.
It was incorporated.
When?
I don't know the date, but there was an incorporation.
I haven't been able to find it. We know that at the end the bank owned it. They just pulled the plug and took it over. Anyway, in 1843, now this is what the Barbers wrote themselves. The Barber brothers and Mr. B. Franklin, since then, started a woolen mill in Streetsville about the same proportions as the one at Georgetown at that time. The Barbers are pretty smart people. The Georgetown time is a much better story because they developed dynamos and everything. As the country grew, so did each factory until the Georgetown one had too much machinery, and the one in Streetsville had too much for its buildings. A new building was consequently erected in the latter place in 1852, and that's it. And the machinery from both mills placed in. And by 1877, it was the most extensive manufactories in the province of Ontario. A view of which may be seen among our illustrations. I think we have it on the slide. It's not very good, but this is it. The main buildings, and today that's where our churches. This should be over there.
It's backwards.
Because I have the original here. Here's what it should look like. A much better picture. That's a lousy slide. The chimney is on that side, just to reverse it. Well, anyway, as you can see, it was a very large establishment. Probably the biggest one ever on the river, actually, until recent years. And this is a description of it. Oh, well, I should mention that in 1861 they had a fire and had to rebuild it all. So this describes the second plant. It's all made of stone. Several buildings, the main building being 125 feet by 50 feet, 4 stories high. So that's right in the The mule and the warping room. Does anybody need an explanation of what that is? This is a loom. Was 30 by 84 and 3 stories. Adjoining the mule room is the dye house, also built of stone, and it was 30 by 50. And then comes the boiler house, which you can see by the chimney. And the dry room, built of stone. And it was 18 by 96. It was that tall, long, thin building for the chimneys. The wool house, which is stone also. The wool was sorted and stored. And it is then conveyed to the dye house, scoured and dried, then taken to the top story of the garret of the main mill. Way up there. And there were 8 sets of cards. You people know what a set of cards is. There's not much to play with. What's a set of cards?
Carding.
Right. So where they straightened the wool it was called a card, and it came in sets. Because you weren't one against the other ones. And then you went down to the spinning room, because once you got it straightened out, then you put it into the spinners. And they had 24 spinners. All latest attachments. And after the wool is taken to the spinning room, where it is situated on the 3rd flat, and they had several jacks and 2 mules. Need anybody an explanation what a jack and a mule is, or a wool? Well, if you're spinning, you know how wool is spun. It's stretched out. And in order to stretch it out, you have something on tracks. And that's called. Okay? And they had 2 mules, and a double and a twister. What's that? Well, if you want to make a bigger yarn, you take 2 strands and double it and twist it together so it don't come apart. And that's done by machinery. All of the most improved manufacture. And there's made into yarn and taken to the 2nd flat to the weaving room. And there are scores of women weaving yarn into all kinds of Canadian tweeds. The looms were narrow looms. I don't know, do you remember how narrow they were, 24s or 30s?
Well, depending on what you were doing, and it would range from 24. And when they did the carpeting, that was the widest, and that was 36 inches.
Yeah. Anyway, they were narrow looms. And then the cloth, after it's been woven, it's taken to the finishing room where it's washed, scoured, examined, and folded. You know what folding means?
That's for blanket.
That's where
Lovely
you
blanket.
get the stretch out. And then it goes on to say the mill is lit up with gas, manufactured on the premise from gas oil. What's gas oil?
Kerosene.
No, not yet. That was raw crude oil. And there was a small factory in Coastville at this time making a very crude kerosene. And they wouldn't attempt to make gasoline because it was too dangerous to work with. Matter of fact, gasoline wasn't made until about 1900. Because there was no market for it. Until we had the automobile, you didn't know what to do with gasoline. It was a pain in the neck. You could always use kerosene. Always had an oil light. Well, anyway, that was the biggest mill on the river. And that was written in 1877. 7 years later, the bank pulled all the loans. The place closed, and it was derelict. Anybody, I think you could guess what happened?
And the fire.
No.
It was simply that the demand for what they were manufacturing was gradually decreasing because people wanted finer, more imported goods, and because you had railways and roads by then,
Right.
people went to the city to get their finer, roller goods, and so the demand for what the Barber brothers
And one more
manufactured
thing, which you haven't mentioned.
increased.
The Civil War was over. You had lots of cottons. Cotton was a lot easier to make and a lot easier to print for nice designs and much, much cheaper. than anything made of wool.
That's what we're.
I
Yeah.
understood that the material they made there was called plush, which is of course.
Well, that was later on. I come to that. That was only for earlier. But the barbers had it. That's what happened. Is time got ahead of it. When we had fancy cottons, and we had nice cotton mills in Toronto by this time, and there were new materials to make carpets of it, the barber mills just simply were obsolete. They couldn't meet their bills, and the bank just pulled the plug. Another victim. It's a shame because it was a beautiful deal. Now, this is something I'm very interested in. Two of these are still there on a map. The third one's gone. These were the cottages in which the millers and so on lived. In one of those, according to the 71 census, 2 parents and 6 children. Now, these are 2 cottages. We're talking about this happened. 2 parents, 6 kids. And the man had a salary of $4.50 a week. Compare that with Mr. William Barber's house. And that tells you this, the situation that was common everywhere. And that's where we started to get labor unions. A man and a wife and 6 kids living on $4.50 a week, and Mr. Barber just around the corner in a big, beautiful white house with servants. But that was normal at that time. We don't see it anymore. Now I could go on. How's my time? Oh, almost 9 o'clock. We're doing good. There's all kinds of material. I've done a survey on the Barber House in the according to the census of 1871, which is the best record we've got. This is the kind of people that were at this plant. We had weavers, spinners, carters, tailors, because they had they made clothing there. Wool sorters, well, you had to have them, that's where you started. They had wool dyers, they had loom trimmers, that's the guy that went around and set the loom up. They had fullers, that's the one that shrunk the wool. They had machinists, well, obviously you had machinists, well, that kind of machinery around. You had a cloth finisher, and you had firemen for the boilers, naturally. And you had a designer, and a teamster, because there was no railroad, everything had to be taken in and out by team. And they had a watchman. Now you'd wonder what a place as tightly bound as that you needed a watchman. But they did, they had a watchman. And they had a boarding house keeper, it shows you one, I didn't show it to you on there. And they had accountants, and of course, they had salesmen. There is the list of the people that actually lived in those cottages. This is from the 71 census. The boarding house had 4 people living in it, besides the operator. Married people with 4 children, 2 children, 2 children, 4 children, 1 child, 2 children. You know, when you go around these new subdivisions, you wonder how the devil those people lived in those cottages with that many kids. Of course, I guess you get used to it when you don't have any dreams. But there they are.
You slept them in piles like cordwood.
Well, I mean, the kitchen was only about, well, did anybody here been in those little cottages? I never measured the room, but I think the kitchen is about 12 feet square. And there's only two rooms downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs.
6 people in one room.
Well, Bill, I think the most unique thing that a lot of people don't realize about that factory was that we think today that factory outlet is something very unique, but actually back then,
Yeah.
a farmer could bring his raw wool to the Barber Brothers and draw up a contract
Right?
to have his wool washed, carded, dyed,
Oh, yeah.
spun to whatever color of his choice, woven to the fabric of his choice, and then taken across to the tailor shop that had 16 tailorses, and they would make his
Yeah.
special material into custom clothes, and he could come to the factory and pick up his custom clothes.
Well, but that was one of the reasons why the bank broke. Look, they ran out of customers at the price they could afford to pay. Now, how many houses were there in Bartown? This has always been a matter of dispute. The article in the Atlas, in the article, says there were 43 plus the residences of the owners. Well, there were 2 residences. One was William and the other was Robert. Sandy was one of the perpetrators of much of the mythology about 75 years ago. Wrote articles in the Streetsville Review. And he, of course, copied that right out of the Atlas for 43. So I got nosy one day and went through the records in the archives and went through the records at the census. And the census is very interesting reading. It gives numbers, type of work to each household, and Barberton area starts with number 217 in the register and ends with 252. And of these, 2 are Barber residences and 1 is the boarding house. That leaves a total of 32 actual dwellings. Now, it's perfectly clear that there could be 43 buildings, but only 32 were actually residences. And how many people worked at the mill? The Atlas states 175 to 200. Sandy's notes, who's this guy that wrote the review in the 1920s, picked up the same figures. It's 200 workers. Well, the 1971 census, and this was done when the mill was at its peak. It was on the downslide, actually. And it gives exact numbers of employees. 56 men, 31 women, 23 boys, and 10 girls, which is a total of 129.
Sounds right.
So where Sandy got us figured at 200, I haven't got a clue. They just weren't there. But you notice the number of boys and girls. And maybe that explains why a man and wife and 4 kids could live in a house on $4.50 a week. Some of those kids were working in the mill. Must have been.
One of the children was blinded because someone accidentally spilled a dye vat and it got in his eyes and he was blinded.
Well, I wouldn't doubt it. I mean, people were always getting, anybody that worked in the iron, which my family worked in the iron business, and you're getting that sort of thing all the time. There were no such things as safety regulations. Now, is there any question about the Barber Mill? I'm just about 9:04, which isn't bad. Now, we'll go to the last one, which is the best example we've got. As you notice, my notes are fell on the floor, and they're all here just to get them in the right order. And I have to apologize. I have definitely recorded fine.
Because my cousin still
But I survived. No, it's all right. It's just to get the right one. But I can do it again quiet. The last place, the first reference we have to it is in the 1851 census. And it says, this is interesting, Mrs. Helen Beatty, spelled B-E-A-T-Y. Well, I'm not too sure whether they called it Beatty when you spell it that way or whether they called it that. Does anybody know? Does nobody here know? Knows the family. Well, anyway, talk about your Victorian ladies. I told you about Mary Hyde that took over after her husband on the big Ontario mills. Well, this was Mrs. Helen Beatty. Has a mill, 4 stories high, and 3 runs of stone. Cost 2,000 pounds. It produces 25 horsepower and produces 30,000 barrels of flour per year, that would be quite. And this mill is a frame building on a good stone foundation. You'll get that in every description of it. And this mill, now this is the census of 1854, 51. And this mill was built about 5 or 6 years ago. It is about where the river credit passes down from Mr. John Street's mill in an easterly curve. And there is also a new barley mill, which is not yet in production. What's a barley mill? Don't you ladies know what a barley mill is? When is the last time any of you bought pearl barley?
soup.
Well, a barley mill is you return a barley kernel into pearl barley. You've got to get rid of the husk, you've got to get rid of all the others. But she had, by the time of this census, 1851, she hadn't got going. But she must have been a remarkable woman, because she ran that mill until it was sold out to the Reed family about 1895. And then came the revolution, because it had been a stone mill. Now, could I have the last slide, which is the... That's what it looks like today, because that part is up above where you can see it. This is taken from Eglinton Avenue, that's the real thing. Next one. Right. Part of that mill is the original 1850 mill. It's been rebuilt, and it's been run by the same family for a century. Highly respectable, highly profitable, and very quiet people. No publicity. You never see their pictures in an atlas. Didn't believe in that sort of. But unfortunately, eventually, you run out of reeds. And that's what happened here. The bill was sold to Nabisco and tremendously expanded. It is the largest mill of its kind in North America. It works only on soft wheat, producing soft wheat flour, which is used in making water. Oh, come on, ladies.
Cakes and pies.
Sorry?
Cakes and pies. Cakes. And
Cakes, and the other one, the big seller. Cookies. If you eat a cookie made by Nabisco, or almost anybody else in this part of North America, you're eating wheat treated in that. It's also the largest supplier of bran mix. Because the first thing you do when you go through the mill is take the bran. And then you take the wheat germ out. And then you start to roll the flour. And that is known as the roller process. It's actually invented it's called the Hungarian process, I don't know why. It was invented in Switzerland about 1880 or something. The Reeds put it into this plant shortly after they bought it. The roller process is absolutely the opposite to a stone process. The rollers are about that wide. The final ones where they make the fine flour are actually China, porcelain, ceramics. There were ones before that are various things. And the first time you put it through the roller is known as the cracker. And that takes off the bran. And then that goes up to the bolts. You know the bolt is. Goes up to the bolts and the bran comes out. And then you put it through the next set of rollers. And then you take out the wheat germ. And it goes up to the bolts and it's taken out. And some very fine flours, you can go through that process 6, 7, or 8 times. Now the machinery used to be that you went from floor to floor with these little cups on a leather belt, or cotton belt again. And you had that clatter, 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 clatter. Everybody in that did an old-fashioned wheat mill, and that one is running, and you've got this, it is very distinctive sound. The clatter, clatter of these things going up and down. Well, that all went out a few years ago at the wheat mill, or the Nabisco mill. It's now a pneumatic process. It's all done by compressed air. Everything. From the time the grain goes through the crackers until it comes out as a flour in the bag. They have a niche market, as you guys explained. They make the flour for nearly all of the cooking oil, of course, owned by Nabisco. That makes sense, doesn't it? And Nabisco makes what? Shredded wheat. Well, that's a different plant. That plant used to be in Niagara Falls. Where did they move it to someplace? Someplace in the States. So I've given you 3. I've given you the one that was a totally disastrous, but it could have been a beautiful thing there. I've shown you the barbers, which had a sharp, flashy run. And I didn't tell you what happened afterwards. The bank owned the place. Couldn't do anything with it. 2 attempts were made to form new companies by Streetsville people. Neither one of them got off the ground. Although one record we had is that they got rid of the small looms so they could go to broad loom. Do you ever know where that term broad loom came from? And that's a kind of a loss, isn't it? Well, because it's made of a broad loom. Whereas the barbers were using small looms, narrow looms, which is where you made your carpet those days, so you sewed your. Has anybody in this room ever done that? Taken up an old-fashioned carpet and there are pieces about this wide and they're about 6 of them across the room. Everyone had them. Sewn together. Don't see it anymore because the carpets today are long and they're broad. Some of them pretty broad, 30 feet. Well, anyway, and I showed you the last one, the one you don't hear much about, but it was the most successful mill on the river. Thank you very much.